Good job.
Yeah.
And it's funny because my second daughter was born with me wearing a MoDev t-shirt. In fact, when we posted the picture from the hospital, Pete texted me as like, "That's a MoDev t-shirt you're wearing." And I gotta tell you, those MoDev t-shirts were comfortable. Yes. So a great job. Yes. So my name is Morgan Reed, and I used to be the executive director. Now I'm the president. I'm fancy. I'm fancy like Applebee's in that regard. So it was great to follow the previous presenter because she touched on a lot of topics in the sense of what's the art of the possible. And when I first started thinking about what we needed to talk about in this conference, sitting around saying everybody here knows more about natural language processing than I do in the moment. Everybody here has a better sense of what they're doing structurally with AI. But what I'm really starting to see is the tendrils of which the way that the audiences that you're interacting with have a regulatory sphere. And when I thought about doing this presentation, I actually thought that the title should be How to Pitch the General Counsel. Because I realized when you're all walking into a meeting, you're probably talking to somebody who says, "I have a problem. How does your product solve my problem?" But for your person that you're selling to, they have an internal audience inside their company known as the compliance officer. And that compliance officer has a completely different set of metrics that they're trying to achieve, rather than the guy you're selling to who says, "Tell me how natural language processing helps me onboard employees," or "Tell me how your vocal chatbot helps me satisfy customers." Somebody's going to ask the next question, which is, yes, but what do we do about the regulatory sphere and how from there? So in short, most of you already understand this, speech recognition, speech tagging, sentiment analysis, natural language generation, all of these are stuff you know well. The challenges on this are a little interesting. Privacy rules, consent, how do you get it, right? Right now when you're on the web, you click through, somebody throws a screen up and you hit accept. How do you do accept in the context of speech? How do you present a 47-page terms of service agreement for handling somebody's data in a way when you've got to do it over voice and speech? These are questions that we have to think about. Accuracy, right? One of the things we're going to have to think about is how do you do this data in accurate fashion? How do you tell people what you're doing with the data? First Amendment. We actually have an active case right now on Clearview AI that's going to test some of those questions about First Amendment. Civil rights, OSHA, ADA. You heard a great presentation about being inclusive. Well, how is your product, your natural language processing, your AI engine on the back end, going to deal with questions about what are employee safety? How are you dealing with making sure that an employee has an equivalent work environment to someone else? So these are things you're going to have to answer, not for the guy you're selling the solution to, but for his internal client, known as the compliance officer. So I'm not just making this up. This was the recent Forbes headline, "The Creeping Cost of Compliance, How Financial Services," great client potential for all of you, can manage the cost and complexity of compliance while maintaining a great experience. This one I love. This is Compliance Week. Yes, people. There is a literal magazine that comes out weekly just for the compliance audience. But I thought this one was particularly interesting. CCPA, that's the California Privacy Bill. The compliance costs for just California are expected to be $55 billion. I love that there is a magazine just dedicated to these folks. And then in the EU, in the area that I spend a lot of my time in healthcare, they're expecting that just compliance alone is about 5% of revenue just in the EU alone dealing with these questions. So big companies, billions of dollars dealing with it. But why are people freaking out by this? So this was about a little bit over 2 months ago, the United States Senate had a hearing about privacy. So that's me there in my glasses. Maureen Olhausen was the former acting chair of the Federal Trade Commission. And this gentleman here, blurry and pixelated, is a guy named David Vladeck. He's a friend. I like David Vladeck. He's a nice guy. He's the former director of the consumer protection part of the FTC. Here was Vladeck's quote. Now, that hearing that I was testifying at, the question that was being asked is, should the United States government give the Federal Trade Commission an extra $1 billion, not million, $1 billion to help on compliance, and AI is part of what they're going to hire. So $1 billion, and the former head of compliance is really the only tool is a lawsuit. So that's what's driving your customers internally. There's some guy in an overly priced suit who probably came out of a law firm, and his job is to make sure they never have to talk to David Vladeck. And that's what the compliance people are looking at from their perspective. So you'd say, well, that's great, that's federal, I don't have to worry about it, no big deal, my company's got this under control. Last year alone, the United States had 99 different privacy bills introduced. California, you probably all know about, that's a big privacy bill, most of the people. 2 other states passed them, and there are 99 others on the books. 47 states are predicted to have different, separate privacy laws throughout the United States. And guess what? Each one of them deals with natural language processing and AI and machine learning in the context of data, and they don't even use the same definitions. Some of the bills define artificial intelligence one way, some do it in another, some describe personally identifiable information in one way, some describe it in another. So again, thinking about your client, you want to sell a product, their compliance officer is looking at the same map and he's thinking about how much billable hours is he going to have to spend at a law firm. So the environment for you is, how do I build a product? How do I differentiate myself from my competitors? One of the ways to do so is, how are you going to go about answering some of those questions? So there are really 3 things you kind of have to think about. The 3 big ones: privacy, which we already talked about, bias, and data set integrity. I spent about 40% of my life working with the Food and Drug Administration and HHS and others in the context of AI and what's called software as a medical device. So, or in the context of working with General Motors or any of the automobile industry, or you're working in the healthcare space, data set integrity is one of the key things. The Food and Drug Administration's, their focus is on what they call the triangle of risk. And so what their questions they want to know is, tell us how you're developing your data set, what data sets you're using, and how do those data sets, how can you explain those data sets? Something was referred to as explainability. If you can handle data set integrity and data set explainability, then it's pretty easy to get your AI-powered product through the Food and Drug Administration. If you can't answer that bottom question, you're not getting through. Bias has become absolutely one of the most important questions, and we may think of the really obvious ones, right? Like the Google camera that couldn't detect people of color and only did white people, right? That's the obvious stuff. But bias often enters into your voice data sets in other ways, and this gets into a part of how you're thinking about reselling your data. If that data and what people order has an impact on the jobs that they can get, the homes that they can buy, the loans that they may get, you need to look at how you're coming up with that data set and where that data set may sit. Because in the reality is that if you're pulling data in, manipulating it, coming up with some real new learning, and then that data gets sold on, or the engine that you've developed gets sold on or used by somebody else, it can have implications. So I've done a dozen major meetings at the White House and others, and the bias question comes up, and that's regardless of party. That's been a big topic on AI in healthcare, in transportation, and in almost every sector. Privacy, I feel like everybody understands it, but I will tell you right now, as you're thinking about selling your product, if you're walking into that to offer a solution, make sure you can describe how you're meeting those and what innovative ways you found to explain it. So the answer isn't all doom and gloom. I think that it's probably one of the singular ways you can help differentiate your product from someone else is to basically say, I'm a grown-up. I've thought about those questions, and here's how we're handling them. So, it's not all pew, pew, pew. We just developed a solution, and we're going with it. And we used, GPT-3, and we don't have to answer any questions. If you think about it in advance, you will get your product sold faster than the guy who doesn't handle the compliance section. So I'll give you some examples. InSkill AI is a company that's using AI, natural language processing, and other tools to essentially upskill an aging population. Last speaker talked about aging boomers. Here's a little healthcare stat for you. If you want to be in the natural language processing healthcare space, it's a good one. And part of the reason is very simple. By 2025, the American Medical Association, one of our board members, estimates that there will be a shortage of over 90,000 physicians in the United States. During COVID, we've lost about 500,000 healthcare workers. But here's the kicker. By 2035, there will be 70 million Americans over the age of 65. 80% will have at least one chronic condition. We literally cannot provide the health care that people have earned through paying into the systems, through their insurance, with the number of physicians and caregivers we have. So Remote patient monitoring, telemedicine services, patient engagement through your tools are going to have to fill the gap. Like, climate change is a huge issue, but you know what? This one's going to hit us a lot sooner than any meteor from outer space. By 2035, we won't have enough doctors, and we'll have too many old people with diabetes and hypertension and behavioral health issues that your tools can help solve. So what InSkill did was they had to think about upskilling for an aging population, and when you upskill, you've got to think about what are the traits that you're learning. You have to answer questions about OSHA. You have to answer questions about Americans with Disabilities Act. So when they walked into the room to work on a product that they had, they were already ahead of the reskilling questions because they were dealing with the compliance questions before they launched the product. And with that success, they've had incredible growth and incredible success in getting the products into hands. But that's a small guy. Maybe it's just the little guys, you know, they're just scratching and biting. But Microsoft. How many of you seen Microsoft has bought Nuance? Why did they buy Nuance? 77% of hospitals in the United States use speech to text to do electronic health records. Because of a piece of legislation known as the Cures Act, hospitals and others, and back to ACA, are required to make electronic health records available. So doctors now, their reimbursement, their pay is tied to a complex system of codes and electronic health records and everything else. So literally 20% of the GDP of the United States, roughly $3 trillion, a trillion of which flows through Medicare and Medicaid, relies on electronic health records. $16 billion Microsoft buys for Nuance. One of Microsoft's key privacy people is a woman named Julie Brill, who's a friend of mine. Julie Brill used to be the commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission. Do you remember that slide earlier when I said the Federal Trade Commission needs money to sue people? Who did Microsoft hire when they're dealing with this? They hired Julie Brill at the FTC, and she was the person at the FTC who did privacy. So big companies are already thinking about it. So Microsoft's solution, why they're buying Nuance, is they've already baked in compliance into a lot of their cloud products. You saw that with GDPR. When we all freaked out about Europe and privacy laws and how we're going to deal with it, Microsoft and some of the big guys stepped up, hired armies of lawyers and said, you know what? We're going to change privacy from a risk into a service we're going to sell. So now, when you want to go to Microsoft to use their cloud services, they'll actually give you or allow you, or through their services, handle certain aspects of GDPR, essentially on your behalf as a client. So Microsoft is buying Nuance because it fits into their pattern. Highly regulated industry, healthcare, one of the most highly regulated industries you can find. Microsoft already has baked in the compliance tools on their cloud services, in their machine learning. They released an entire good machine learning practices plan around this, and they spent $16 billion to buy this. And I know when companies have $2 trillion, maybe that doesn't mean much, but somebody's annual bonus is tied to a $16 billion purchase, so somebody at Microsoft cares. Google, we talked about healthcare, we heard about Alexa skills and things like that. Here's the other big one. And when we talked about privacy laws and everything else, guess what? NHTSA and the Department of Transportation, they care about voice as well. And you see right here, GM gets into the car voice control game with Google. All that's great. Most of this you already know. But take a look at that last line. The agreement with Google allows sharing of data with General Motors. So for them, natural language processing isn't just helping you drive your car. Natural language processing and the AI engines and the skills that they learn from that data are also about the next car and the next car. And importantly, what cars customers like. Do they like blue? Do they like green? A whole universe of data that General Motors is hoping to collect through this. And guess what that means? Privacy laws. That means NHTSA. That means Department of Transportation. Everybody's going to ask questions. How are you doing that data? How long do you hold it? When do you get rid of it? What part of it is personally identifiable? What are you doing to de-identify? Is it encrypted? So all of these questions are things that they're going to answer. And Google, of course, has armies of lawyers, and they can answer it. So from a little tiny company like InSkill, to Microsoft, who's making a huge play, to Google, who we all know is a big player in this space, Amazon, Apple, they're all in the game. And they all have significant compliance departments. So where can you find some answers on this? Have I got my card yet, or am I still okay? Whew, okay, because I wanted to go through and ask some questions. So right now, Brad, where's your hand? He's in a mask, wave your hand. So Brad can talk to you guys afterwards, but there are verticals of tools that are helpful for you and documents that you can use that are not written for lawyers that you can go to and say, okay, how do I get some handle on this? Because if you're looking to sell to your client, the part that you need to know is, how do I talk to my client about getting to yes, but helping him get to yes with their internal compliance questions? So if you're in the healthcare vertical, we can both provide you some documents, and Brad raised his hands. There's also great documents from the Food and Drug Administration around what they're looking at. There's a good machine learning practices document that's been developed in that space. In the transportation space, NHTSA has a series of questions that they've asked, and that's something else we can guide you to or point you to the links to understand. And then probably the most important question I would say is on the privacy side, and where my ask for all of you is, on the privacy side, this is going to be a fight. Because if there are 47 different state laws that you have to comply with, and you aren't Google, and you aren't Microsoft, and you aren't Apple, then where do you get the lawyers and the manpower and the FTE to make sure you're complying? And so we can provide solutions that already exist on some of this, and some of this is going to have to be work that you're going to have to do as part of the larger industry to make sure that your voice is heard. Now, I don't think anybody in this room wants to harm anybody's privacy, but I'm sure all of you would like to have a standard definition. So if you have a customer in Pennsylvania and a customer in Colorado, the way that you handle that data is transactionally the same. But as we're headed right now, it won't be. And the definitions and the length you hold. For example, I don't know if any of you are familiar with data breach laws. Show of hands, some awareness of this. So one of the things that's really interesting that's happened on this, to make this real for you, is for a while there, in some states, the data breach law said, if your data has been breached and a Russian hacker has broken in, you must not tell anyone until you've told law enforcement. That state says you must immediately tell somebody and you must not wait more than 24 hours to tell them. And then in that state it said you must ask permission to tell people from law enforcement before you tell them. So if you're a practitioner, how do you do tell them now, tell them never, wait for permission to tell them? Oh, and don't forget over here we've got an EU citizen. By the way, GDPR applies to an EU citizen living in the United States. Because from a European perspective, privacy is a human right. It is not something that is granted through a government fiat. So if she's an EU citizen, he's a Pennsylvanian, he's a Coloradan, and he's a Georgian, your data breach laws are wildly different in how you do it. And right now, what's shaping up in the United States is, and it's not letting me go back, is multiple state laws that are going to do the same thing. So when you're going in to talk to your client, one of the questions to ask them is, how do you want us to handle the data? What questions about sharing? And that comes to a key part, ask them about how do you get to consent. As I mentioned earlier, consent is really hard to do with voice if there's no button to click. So the reason I mention that is this top name here, Lori Craner. She is a research professor at Carnegie Mellon, and she is the leading, I don't think I would say advocate. She is the leading researcher on these questions about what does authentic permission mean? What does it mean to consent? What do you understand? And the idea of the reason that a 47-page terms of service fails versus a short-form notice or just-in-time notice or all of those features. So if you've got a product and you need to use that data and it's informing your engine, Lori Craner is one of the researchers who's really led on that. On the questions of making that logic understandable, Professor Rao has been one of the key players out of Arizona State University on shaping how we think about those questions. So we've got resources, others have resources, but ultimately what I'd like you to do after you leave here is look at how you're pitching your customer and think about the customer that you're going, and then ask yourself the question is, how am I going to be able to answer the compliance questions at the front end? And if I'm really good at my job, how do I actually beat or even upsell my product for the way that I'm handling data, for the way that I'm meeting their clients, their internal clients' needs, and more importantly, the way that I can articulate to their ultimate customer, the consumer, in how that's going. And so if you have a product that's for, say, in-skilling people, how are you communicating what the company's doing with the data? If you have a product that's reaching out to doctors, how am I tying into their existing EHR system in a way that's compliant? So I think, as much as anything else, you all build great engines. You'll continue to build great engines. I'm telling you, there's an audience that you can sell to at least beat your competitor, if not make sure that the guy who wants to say yes to your product says yes immediately. How am I doing on time? Am I at 5? So I wanted to, since I was really going as fast as possible, because Pete and I talked about making sure there was some time for questions, and then we got back on track. What all questions do you have, either about privacy, where the FDA is on healthcare, or transportation, or any of those questions that may come up? Anyone? Yes, sir. Oh.
One, two. This one right here, the hand. There we go.
There we go. Live mic.
So thank you very much. I appreciate it. My question is regarding the privacy, and I believe what Lori was working on. She's working on a nutrition label
Correct.
for privacy. How do you see that translating to this world of non-visual voice?
And that's exactly the question. So Dr. Craner has been asking that question of how do you get to it. I believe in what Lori and I have talked about at length is what I think of as just-in-time notification. So in other words, if your AI, if your voice collection is going to take that data and use something with it, then you need to be able to say, hi, on the first time use, and say, hey, so glad to have you using this service. Just so you know, the company collects that information, and here are the 3 reasons we do so. We collect it to improve the product. We collect it to make sure that we have integrity and that we're operating in a way that it doesn't include bias. So this is the stuff we ask. And then finally, we use it to make the product better internally as well as externally. So bing, 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 get it done. And then later on, let's say you've got a voice feature and you have a video feature. Hi, we're going to record this video feed. Why? Because we want to see if low light versus high light. Here's how we're using it. And then you might say, oh, but by the way, we don't keep any personally identifiable data. We throw that all away, and we just keep the raw functional. Now, I will warn you, in the healthcare context, you're pretty much never going to dump the data, because if you think of it this way, if you want to buy, if I need to know how many people like black interiors versus tan interiors on the car, I don't care about a lot of your personal detail. If I need to know what are the social determinants of health that might have led to you having cancer, then I need to know a lot of things about you. Maybe what food you eat, Nazi Jew versus a Welshman versus a this. There may be genetic overtones to it. So for healthcare, there is a very, very important reason to know more about you, because maybe if this is you're a woman in your 40s, this medication works better. If you're a man in your 50s, this medication works better. So in that case, personally identifiable information is critical to saving someone's life. And in that case, you need to tell people, hi, thank you for using this product. By the way, we collect that information to make sure that we can have integrity and that we can turn this into life-saving technology. Do you accept? Yes, no. So that's part of how you do it, and that gets to kind of what Lori's working on. Next question.
Anyone? Right here? Anyone privacy? Oh, here we go, right here.
I hope it's okay. I want to ask about accessibility.
Yes.
So I asked that on the app as well, but let's say, how do you have guidance about how we should think about performance of speech TTS or recognition, when I think the spirit of the law is we should make this modality equal to other modalities, but being able to, the TTS output is never going to equal to somebody reading text, or the same thing with recognition. You can improve in the model, but at what point do you say that's enough? I tried to make it equivalent, but it's not, it's never going to reach the that level.
So does everybody understand what we're talking about TTS, about type systems? And so if you're doing speech to text for the blind versus, so one of the problems you run into is, and you talk about the modalities, Part of it is meeting people where their disability is. For example, if you are a person with profound cerebral palsy, but you can hear just fine, but you just can't, you can't move the muscles to make your jaw work. So you might need something else because very few engines are going to be able to understand you. Right? Very few voice-to-speech engines are going to be built with broad enough data set to deal with that. But you know where you do see some of that coming in is accents, right? Everybody in this space understands how hard it is to code or to develop engines that cover the wider range of access. Your question, though, is how do I do it if I've got a client who says, does this meet the determination of disability? And the question is, you kind of already answered your question, which is document how you went about getting as close to equal as you can. So if you say, here's what it does, and this is where it gets really interesting and why I was talking about in-skill and some of the ways that people are using voice to text in the context of employees. So part of it is making sure that there are no barriers for that person to work or no barriers for that person to buy the product. Now it's funny because, we want people to buy, so we'll do just about anything to make it easier to buy. But you have to ask yourself, are we doing just about anything to make it easier for people to do their jobs? And that's at the core of your question, which is, if we can't make it equal to TTS, how do we show that we're getting close? And in that case, you do what you said, which is get as close as possible, demonstrate the attempt, and demonstrate that the gap is, at present, not solvable technologically. If you do that, back to who's your audience, right, compliance officers, you have a moral obligation, I would say, to do the best you can, right? I wouldn't shirk it. But beyond that, you also need to make sure your client understands it. So that would be the first thing. Hit your mark, demonstrate where the gap is, and then work to fill it and describe how you're going to try to do it. But you're totally right. You're not going to ever get to 100%. Next question? Oh, there were one more.
We got time for one more. And then it's party time. Anybody ready?
Sorry to hold you away from booze. I got to get going too.
From the perspective of consumer, I want you to talk about how do I assert ownership over my data, control ownership and permissioning, and especially of increasingly biometrics data that's being collected for many of the apps.
So this gets into a weird space. It also depends on where you're talking about. In the case of healthcare, the patient owns their data. Now, the physician co-owns that data, and everybody's favorite law to get wrong, HIPAA, by the way, how many people know what the P stands for in HIPAA? Does it stand for privacy? How many people think it stands for privacy? Hands up. It does not. It stands for portability. It's okay, that was a trick question. So that's actually the reality. HIPAA is not a privacy law at all. HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accessibility Act. The privacy portion of HIPAA is actually called the HIPAA rule because it's not actually written into the law. What Congress did is they wrote portability, which you all should love because that's what gives you access to electronic health records. And they said, woof, we can't figure out this privacy stuff, so if we don't pass a new law in 2 years, HHS, go write a regulation. The reason that the HIPAA privacy stuff is so confusing is because Congress didn't write it. It was literally written by bureaucrats trying to interpret the will of Congress with no text to go from. It'd be like writing the Bible off of half of the 10 Commandments, right? There was nothing there, and they just had to make up a bunch of stuff. Basically, yeah, that is true. Actually, that was a bad analogy because there's some accuracy there. But that's part of the problem with HIPAA. So to your question, HIPAA raises some really interesting problems because the ownership of that data is co-owned. In the case of consumer data with Alexa, same kind of thing. You may own the data or you may own the result of processing that data, but if you're dealing with a privacy law like GDPR, the question you really should be asked is if the consumer asserts their ownership of the data and they say, I want it out of there. The question that we've been dealing with in the AI community is simple. If a consumer takes their data out, I obviously have to delete it. No problem. That's straight black letter law. If a consumer says, get my data out of your system, at that point you can take it out. Here's the question. Do you have to go back and retrain all your engines and all of your learning? So far, the courts have said no. But I will warn you, this is an ongoing question. And this is why, that slide I said are the three big things you want to talk about, bias, privacy, data set integrity, know the answers to those because that's where the problem is lying, right? People are saying, the data you collected on me led to, you trained an engine and I didn't get a loan in the case of financial services industry. I want you to pull that out, rerun the data so that my numbers are better and that I can get a home loan. That's one of the arguments that people are presenting as we do machine learning. Same thing for likelihood to get a speeding ticket or anything else that you can think of where there might be a financial impact on someone. So as you're thinking about this and as you're doing it, you need to be able to answer yourself the question on how do I demonstrate that I have done my work to do A/B testing and make sure that I've done red team testing to make sure that I am rooting out the bias. Because if somebody can make the argument that the use of your product led to a higher price. How many of you remember a while back, and I know I gotta go, but a while back Nordstrom's was busted for the fact that they were giving different prices to different customers, right? If you were rich, you paid more. If you didn't have so much money, you'd get a slightly different price online. They were doing A/B testing for prices, and customers figured out that depending on who you logged in on, your prices would be different. Now, imagine that in our world of machine learning, where you say, hey Alexa, order me this. Now, if Amazon knows that you're willing to pay slightly more for something, and you just say, Amazon, order me strawberries. All right, Morgan Reed, your strawberries have been ordered. If Amazon is aware using the data sets that exist on me that I'm willing to pay $7 for strawberries, but you're only willing to pay $4, wow, whoo, that's a pretty hot question. And that's the kind of stuff that's getting into some of these questions about data ownership and integrity. Because if you don't answer that question right, then the person who demands their data and says you have to retrain your engine, they've got a point. Because it's had a material impact, the use of their data has had a material impact. And if the law says that they can remove their data, then the ownership question you raise becomes really interesting. So, first of all, don't do that, right? Don't use your engine to essentially charge this person this and the other person that, especially based on characteristics. Well, how about we just don't do that? But second of all, if your client needs you to do some things like that, document how you're doing it, raise questions with it with their own internal compliance officers, and say what you said, which is, how are we going to make sure that we own this, and what are we doing if somebody says, oh, no, I want it back? Pete?
Morgan, let's give it up for Morgan Reed. Time to party. Morgan, thank you so much.